Yeah, I can tell you early. They should stop. They should like a girl.
Well, they're gonna have to kick it.
Get more mad.
All right, be saying, y'all.
For example.
Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting will be called to order. What is a progressive? I feel like I've said it 15 times already, but it still hasn't penetrated some of your minds because, let's face it, some of you are here, but not really here. Remember fifth grade, be here now. So hopefully your minds are engaged. In today's political banter, the word progressive is a very divisive word, right? It's like progressives, that's the left, that's the Democrats. And so that if you're on the Republican side, it's like progressives. And then if you're on that side, it's like, yes, progressives, we're the enlightened ones. We're not talking about modern political arena. We're talking about the roots of progressivism. And we're talking about an idea that was actually embraced by both parties. Believe that? There were things that people used to agree on.
What?
Can you believe it? Like, pick any topic, and it's like, one side's like way over here and the other side's way over there. Doesn't it seem like that? Like there seems to be very little common ground. Well, this idea that we had to change things, that there had to be reform, wasn't just a Democrat or Republican thing. There were progressive presidents that were Democrat. There were progressive presidents that were Republican. Kind of weird, huh? Yeah. Yes. All right. So this is what's going on. And by the way, in order to have an amendment passed, Riley, it kind of is more evidence of how the progressive movement started as a non-partisan thing, or you might say bipartisan thing, right? It wasn't such a partisan idea because does anybody remember what it takes to get an amendment passed? What does it take? Does it take just a simple majority? Let's start there. Scott.
3/4 of agreement.
It takes 3/4 of the states to ratify that amendment. And before that even happens, it takes 2/3 of the state legislatures to go along with the idea of putting it up for a vote. So you can't just have 51% think that this is a change we need to make. The founders wanted to make change, by the way. The founders wanted to make changes in our government and in our policies very methodical and slow. They did not want our society to be living like this. Did you ever do that? You know, in golf course? See which way the wind's actually blowing? Did you ever test the wind by licking your finger and whichever side drives first? Nobody's ever done that? Yeah, you just learned something new. You go like this, you get your finger wet, you put it up there, and the side that the wind's blowing from is going to drive first. No one's ever heard of that. Wow. Okay, so our government does not, we're not a republic established. They wanted our republic to last. They studied all these republics in history, and they said, how can we have this representative government and not have it flame out like all the other ones did through history? How can we have a long-lasting, this great experiment we're about to embark on? When Benjamin Franklin walked out of Independence Hall and the woman asked him, hey, what'd you guys come up with in there? Because remember, it was all done in secret. They didn't want it all to get out. They didn't want rumors to be spreading. And Franklin looked and said, a republic if you can keep it. That's what we came up with. They knew it was going to be hard. And they knew that we couldn't sustain this republic. They looked at history and they looked at, what really happens when these republics crumble is, if you really look at it, there's things that happen that you look back in history. You know how they say hindsight is 2020? You never heard of that one either? You've never heard of the phrase hindsight is 2020? No one? What does it mean? If someone says hindsight is 2020, okay. If I go to the doctor and test my vision, and she says your vision's 2020, what's that mean?
That's a year.
Quote unquote perfect vision, right? 2020 is what you want to hear when you go to the eye doctor. So what's hindsight? Hindsight is when you look back, right? Behind. You look behind. So when someone uses the phrase hindsight is 2020, what they're saying is, oh, it's easy to look back and say, oh yeah, I see now, right? You understand what I'm saying? Hindsight's 2020 means you can look back in history. We as students of history can look back and say, why didn't they see that? Can you imagine 50 years from now or 100 years from now, the history books talking about the times that we're living in and someone reading and going, why didn't they see that? Are you with me on this? Like there's things that are happening, like try to do that sometime. Try to like think of yourself being in the future and looking back at the times that we're living in and thinking, what are they going to think of this? What are people, when they look back and they write the history of the beginning of the 21st century, what are they going to go like this? What were those people thinking? Anybody with me? Anybody with me? Like, what were they thinking? Why couldn't they see this? That's what it means hindsight is 2020. So when how did I get off on this? When we look back at progressivism and we see that we see now how the corruption was. I forget how I on the hindsight 2020 thing. I didn't think I would have to explain it. No, I'm lost. If that's the first time you ever heard that, now you know. If anybody remembers what I said right before I said that, let me know. Trigger my mind back to that. Did I use another phrase right before that? Oh, thank you. That the founding of the country was meant to be, the founders didn't want our culture, our political culture to be like changing all the time. So fickle. You know what that word means? Has that been a vocab word yet? Fickle? Like you so easily change. Like your mind is so easily changed. Like, oh, I think that like you lack conviction, you lack principles. The great experiment was intended to last. And that's where I was. When we look back at those cultures that the founders studied, we can look back and see, oh, Rome, how did you not see what was happening? That's where I was with that. The founders wanted it to last, this great experiment. So they wanted change to come slowly. And we're living in a time where we're not really following the process. I was talking about how hard it is to get an amendment, right? You got to have 2/3, not just a simple majority, to even put the amendment up for ratification. And then you have to have, gentlemen, please. Then you have to have 3/4 of the states ratify the amendment to get that change made. So this was no easy thing. They had to have Republicans and Democrats supporting it. That's how we started the class. In order to get an amendment passed, most of the country obviously thought things got changed. We are going down the wrong path. So they have these progressive amendments, and we talked about them already. The federal government has to have more money to get these things changed. We want to provide more democratization. We want the process of our democratic republic, we want it opened up to more people. We want the people to have a say in who their senators are, not just rely on the wisdom of their legislators that they elected. We want them to have a direct say. We want to get rid of, all this cultural corruption. Maybe the root of it is in all the alcohol consumption going on. Have you looked around at all the families that are disintegrating? By the way, when they study other republics, one of the first things you notice with your hindsight is 2020. Hey, look what happened to the disintegration of the family. We just did this in world history. We're looking at Rome is about to fall. What was one of the first things, the symptoms of it? The disintegration of the nuclear family. If we're looking back in history at our times, what do we see in the last 2 generations? The disintegration of the nuclear family, right? Maybe alcohol's causing a lot of this stuff. Why is alcoholism so rampant? Why is the abuse of alcohol so rampant? And then the big one. You call yourself a democracy and half your population isn't even allowed to vote? Elise, how did it take so long? Ever thought about it? How did it take so long? America has existed longer with women not being allowed to vote than it has being allowed to vote. If we're about 240 years old, women have only been allowed to vote for 100 of them. Am I the only one who thinks that's fascinating in a crazy way? Isn't that crazy? A democracy, but half the people can't vote. So that was the 19th Amendment. And you've heard of people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I hope, and Susan B. Anthony, who were at the forefront, who were the founders of this movement that went on for generations before it finally got passed. We're talking before the Civil War. There was this movement afoot to get it right. I mean, women should be allowed to vote. In fact, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and other women like that weren't allowed to vote yet were some of the people that were campaigning the hardest for blacks having the right to vote. So they were campaigning the hardest to get that 15th Amendment passed, that blacks could vote. And yet, when the amendment passed to allow blacks to vote, they weren't included. Not for another 50 years. Kind of crazy. Who knows what the word demographics means? Because I have to explain what that word means before I explain that that's not really how I'm using it in this slide. If someone says demographics, what do you think? You look like you want to say something.
No, I don't.
Anybody? If I say to you the words demographics, what am I saying? What am I talking about? There's no right or wrong. Just throw something out there. What do you think it means? Yeah.
A group of people.
Okay. Must have to do with people, because Mackenzie's like, democracy means people rule. Demos must mean people, and the crassy part must mean rule. So it must be something about people. Demographics, something about people. Graphics are like, if someone was showing you graphics on the screen, they would be showing you like bar graphs and stuff. You with me? So it's data. So people data. Get it? Demographics is data about people. For instance, we had an election last night. We didn't have a national election like for Congress or president, but different states had elections, right? So when they're going to break down an election, they usually give us a bunch of graphics that show us, hey, this group of veterans voted this way. Millennials voted this way. Seniors voted this way. Blacks voted this way. You understand what demographics are now? That's breaking down a population of people into groups to study how each of those groups acted. Having said all that, so if you didn't know what the word demographics means, now you do. But another more general way of looking at demographics is the way I'm putting it up here. I was trying to think of a title for it. Instead of just saying people of the progressive movement, I put demographics of the progressive movement, and all I'm going to tell you is certain people that were leaders of it, like muckrakers. I want to put it back on the shelf. Anybody ever read Pilgrim's Progress? So does anybody remember the character? Does anybody remember the character with the rake? The muckraker. Okay. So I don't think it's a very big part of the story, but the muckraker, they got the nickname from the book Pilgrim's Progress because what was that? Does anybody remember what that guy's problem was? What was the problem identified by the book? What was the muckraker's situation? What was his quote unquote problem? I'm getting a lot of this is like one of the most incredible, like classic. You could glean so much from Pilgrim's Progress. Were you like resisting it because it was a school thing?
No.
It was a great book.
Yeah.
He was like pushing out the negative stuff.
All right. And where was his concentration? Like in the book, he was more focused on things of the earth, right? That's kind of the symbolism there. You know, he's busy instead of having his eyes on the prize. All his thoughts were focused on the dirt ball, basically, right? Well, in this sense, a muckraker in politics is someone that's focusing on the dirt too, and that's all they focus on. All they want to do is rake up the muck, all the dirt, and some of it's good because there was a lot of dirt, wasn't there? We're talking about an era where this whole idea of progressivism came to be because there's so much corruption. So the muckrakers were the journalists writing in the newspapers or writing in magazine articles about this corruption. Muckraking. Exposing. So the good is they were exposing all of this corruption. How would the common person know unless we had journalists, by the way, that were actually practicing journalism and going through the muck trying to find the actual truth? That's another story. That's another show. But they exposed a lot of the corruption. So people were for all of these reforms. Because they're like, whoa, I didn't know that. What? You're kidding. We're living in a world where any politician, like anything they do, we find out right away, right? Social media. Back then, it would have been hard to know what they were doing. There's that man again. There goes that man again. William Jennings Bryan. This is like the third time I think you've written his name. He was, if you remember, the populist candidate. The populist party didn't last very long because every time a third party tries to nudge their way into the political process in America, it doesn't work. We've got a two-party system, like it or not. It's been people have been laboring over, hey, we should have more political parties, and we shouldn't have just two choices, but for 240 years later, here we are. And every time a third party tries to make it, they get squashed by the two parties. So the Populist Party didn't last. So William Jennings Bryan picks up, he goes from the populist candidate, then he becomes a great orator for the progressive movement. And my opinion is he's probably the most popular person in politics to never be president. Remember his campaign, the Whistle Stop campaign, everywhere he went, he would draw these huge crowds.
Yeah.
And McKinley had his, what was his campaign called? He'd just sit on his front porch. Hey, the reporters would come to his house, ask him some questions. He had people out there going to work for him, but it didn't seem like he was very popular. He just kind of, and he got elected anyway. Because Emily and I would like to think that love makes the world go round. But it doesn't. What makes it go round? Money. Unfortunately, money makes the world go round. We'd like to think it's love, but it's not. It's money. And corruption is because of the love of money, by the way. But McKinley had all the money behind him. He had all the corporate interest and all of those things behind him, so he didn't have to go out and do all that campaigning. So some would say that they bought the presidency for McKinley because he just sat on his porch, while William Jennings Bryan was out there drawing all these crowds, very popular, could never break through to become president. But very influential. If you want to read more about him. Then we got not quite as charismatic, but you'll notice something, that William Jennings Bryan is in the Democrat Party and Robert La Follette is in the Republican Party. Both progressives. What? In today's vernacular, a progressive is associated with the left, Democrats, right? Not in its beginning. There was a consensus that things had to change, the corruption had to change. The first witness to this consensus is the amendments. I already say how much you'd have 3/4 support for that. So that was both parties. Now you've got two influential, significant leaders of the progressive movement, one in each party. The roots of the progressive movement are much purer than the fruit we're seeing now. There's that man again. I remember when some of you first heard the name Eugene P. Debs, you probably were like, I've never heard of this person. What kind of name is this? How would this person ever even enter my mind or brain? Only in a history class where we sit boring talking about dead men, right, David? This isn't boring, is it? Good. Right, Jake? Good. Eugene V. Debs. Socialist candidate from 1904 to 1920. And while he got very little support as candidate, when I say the progressives at the beginning are different than they are here 100 years later, if you read into what's going on here, he keeps getting 5 to 10% of the vote. And what's being established is the progressive movement is going to kind of start to lean more towards being synonymous with the socialist agenda. Does that make sense? And that's how we are here today, where you hear these words thrown out there like socialist, progressive, and they seem to be talked about synonymously because the progressive movement has been taken over by that kind of thinking. Does that all make sense? Because my goal for the last week has been to get you to understand what the word progressivism means, what it meant at the beginning, and how we view it today. And this is a big part of that this popularity tends to start resonating more with the Democrat Party. The socialist ideas start to resonate more with the Democrat Party. Not necessarily just the roots of it, like, hey, we gotta get rid of this corruption. Because you can be anti-corporate corrupt and be a Republican, right? And that brings us to this man. Before I put his name up there, I'm pretty sure that every student in this room, whether you like history or not, you don't know every president. I could probably throw out a name and you'd be like, was that guy president? But how many didn't know Teddy Roosevelt? Is there anyone in here that never heard of Teddy Roosevelt? Probably not. And I will submit that no matter what high school student it was, I can go around the country and I'm saying that probably 90% of the kids, no matter how good of a student they are or how much they're into history, if you say Teddy Roosevelt, they probably know he's president. Am I right? Right? Mm-hmm. He's one of those figures that just kind of stands out. Like, they might not even know Ronald Reagan was a president, but they would know Teddy Roosevelt. They would know like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt. Maybe throw in Jefferson. You see what I'm saying? Like, I'm talking about kids that like don't pay attention at all. He's one of 3 progressive presidents. By the way, you've got Democrats and Republican candidates for president, and Democrat and Republicans, quote unquote, progressive presidents. Teddy Roosevelt happens to be the most well-known, popular. And by the way, he's not just popular and well-known because he was a president and because he has a cool nickname, Teddy, and because the teddy bear was named after him. That's all cool. But he's kind of known as one of the... Oh, by the way, you know how we have so much division in our politics today? Here's another thing I would say. I don't have stats on this. I would say a good percentage of Democrats in the 21st century, if you asked them to list their favorite presidents, he'd be in their top 5. If I gave that same question to Republicans, he'd be in their top 5. What? There's something that people can agree on in today's politics? Like, why? Why is this guy so popular and crosses party lines? Well, one of the reasons is because outside of just being a president, it's the man, the myth, the legend. He's like a legendary person outside of politics. And we'll start with one of the most famous political speeches that you probably never heard of. Called The Man in the Arena. Anybody ever heard of that?
Want to help kids get their homework?
To set it up for you, The Man in the Arena. Think about what that title says. In other words, if you think about what an arena is, an arena, like sometimes they'll call a sports facility the arena, right? Quicken Loans Arena, or what's it called now? Rocket Mortgage, whatever. Where people perform, right? Or you could be like in a big, like there'd be a symphony at an arena or whatever. It's a place where people perform, right? So the title to this speech, Man in the Arena, is a title given by a man. And when I say a man, I'm talking about a man's man. I'm talking about somewhat, yeah, Riley, like someone that is like so masculine. Did I say the word? See, Riley, we've spent 2 generations emasculating men. You know what that word means? Emasculating means we are trying to make men less masculine. I don't know if you've heard of that, if this is the first time you've ever thought of that, but we've spent 2 generations trying to emasculate 2 generations of men. And you may have heard people complain in your life amongst adults, like, where are the men these days? I'm talking about men, not just a man. You understand what I'm saying? So people, when they look back at yesteryear and they think, oh, how times used to be better than they are today, where men were men. That's the allure. That's the popularity of Teddy Roosevelt. If you want further study on the emasculation of American men, you can find books all over the place, sociology, psychology, and things like that to study what we've done. Because again, hindsight's 20/20. I have the benefit of hindsight because I'm 4 times older than some of you, at least 3 times older than you, and I can look what's happened to our culture when it comes to men being men. Anyway, Teddy's a man's man. And this speech is just kind of an example of that, where, hey, you, what do we call them? Peanut gallery people that don't want to get in the arena, people that don't want to man up and do what needs to be done. They'd rather sit on the sidelines and complain and critique and even maybe make fun of, he'll use the word sneer at, the people that are actually in the arena trying to get something done because they man up and get in the arena and do it, right? So this isn't just like apply to politics. This could apply to you and whatever, like, hey, you get this idea you want to do, but are you afraid to do it because you might fail? Are you afraid to do it because what other people might think? Think about all the things that don't get done in people's individual lives and in society because people are afraid to, as Mrs. Larissa put it back in 5th grade, stick their neck out. Right? Nobody wants to put themselves out there and man up. It's basketball season starting. Very few people deep down really want to take that shot. You'd rather pass it off to the next guy. Do you want to be in the arena? Or would you rather like, hey, I'll pass it off to them. If they miss it, they can take the criticism. I don't want to take the big shot because then I'm going to get criticized. Actually, LeBron James was criticized for this for most of his career. The first part of his career, he got a lot of criticism because people were saying he would always pass the ball. He didn't want to take the shot. Because what happens if you miss?
The poorest way to face life is to face it with a sneer. There are many men who feel a kind of twisted pride and cynicism. There are many who confine themselves to criticism of the way others do what they themselves dare not even attempt. There is no more unhealthy being, no man less worthy of respect than he who either really holds or feigns to hold an attitude of sneering disbelief toward all that is great and lofty, whether an achievement or in that noble effort which, even if it fails, comes to second achievement. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who was actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again. Because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions? Who spends himself in a worthy cause? Who, at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement? And who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
In other words, all you people out there that like to sit and complain, but no one dares take action. He was a man of action, like in everything he did in life. Legendary things. So he was kind of like calling out those people, you know, that they like to just, cynicism means you're always like cynical, like you're always putting them down, criticizing, sneering at them. Man up and get in the arena. Do you want to take the last shot? If it's game 5 of the volleyball tournament and it's 24-24, are you hoping the ball's served right to you? Or do you even want to serve the ball? Do you want the ball in the 9th inning with the bases loaded and 2 out? Oh, and by the way, the guy before you had to leave with an injury and the count's 2-0 already. Do you want to take that shot? I hope so.
I know Derek. Derek said 2 minutes.
That obviously wasn't Teddy's voice.
Derek would hit a grand slam and moonwalk.
Yeah, no, I hit it like 10.
Well, the next,
Like lasagna.
Do what now? Lizard?
Yeah, do the lizard. Shave it, look.
Do you enjoy it?
okay, we're probably gonna run, should I show it to? It's 6:36. I'm not gonna make it.
That's tomorrow.
6 minutes, 36 seconds. Am I gonna make it or not?
No.
No?
Yeah, we have 3 minutes.
Derek's not just a man.
Not Derek Black. We need to change the package.
Derek's a man already.
We need to change the package to 15.
I know it seems like right now they're just like they did last night.
They beat Arizona.
They beat Arizona, Arizona lost. Listen, I'm telling you, you might think right now, like, oh, they're 7-1, they're going.
Oh, yeah.
The Steelers were 11-0 last year.
Rodgers is the best quarterback in the league.
Not based on his last year.
He is though.
But the Steelers were 11-0.
Yeah, and what did they do to the Browns in the first round?
Stick to it up.
48-37.
I think Derek's got it.
I'm actually sticking around.
He's making fun of me.
You think it's impossible for them? You think it's impossible for the Packers to go 4-6 rest of the year?
No way.
Who would that make? Yeah.
What'd you say? What'd you say?
What are they? 4 and 5. You think it's possible? Go ahead.
They might lose an hour. You're gonna rip it off. I got your back. Thanks. He'll never make fun of you again. That's what
Yeah.
Isaac. You can't rip it off. It's
Three
rip.
hamburgers.
Or no, it's I'll just slide it through. That's it.
Five.
You can't take the 5. I'll use it. We get some tweezers. Tweezers with some really small scissors.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Tiny tip tweezers.
I do know that. I thought you were talking, I was thinking of book.
I thought you were gonna play that. It smells so good. It smells good. You're a bad boy. You've been down there. I'm jealous.